and Billy. I owe you one. More than one. Finally, I would like to thank my parents, Ingrid and George Nagorski, who instilled in me a curiosity about family history and about World War II in particular, through the prism of their own very different but intense experiences. I was captivated by their stories about the war years. My greatest regret is that my father died before we were able to finish the conversation. Author's note. All quotes in this book are taken from personal accounts, written journals, statements made to survivors or rescuers, interviews given to reporters, recordings made for museums or documentaries, or interviews with the author. Where possible, I have checked quotes with others who were present for a conversation. Not surprisingly, I have found that writings, recordings, and statements made in 1940 hold up better to scrutiny than recollections shared 6 decades on. Where I attribute thoughts to any individual, the source is an interview with the author or statements made by that individual in writing or to other survivors. Preface. Bohdan's story. I first heard the story on a Christmas Eve, sometime during the late 1970s, at the New York apartment where Wigilia, the Polish Christmas Eve dinner, had been celebrated in my family for as long as I could remember. My father was Polish, born in Warsaw in 1920, and my mother Norwegian, Oslo 1925, and when I was a child my Christmas holidays were divided roughly between Norway and the apartment in Lower Manhattan where my father's cousins lived. The patriarch of the New York family was my father's uncle, Bohdan, and he could make several claims to his place at the head of the Wigilia table. He was the oldest living Nagorski, for one thing. His birthday happened to fall on December 24th, for another, and he was a warm and charming man, funny, and above all, a superb raconteur. By the time I came to know Bohdan, he was a hunched figure, slow-moving and almost completely deaf. The gesture I came to associate with him was a hand cupped over an ear as he leaned close, watching the lips of whoever was speaking. He was a frail man by then, but his wit and warmth shone through. "It isn't fair," he would say to me. "You're growing like a tree, and I'm only getting smaller and smaller." The annual Christmas Eve highlight was Bohdan's poem, verse that he composed and which he would recite without notes sometime between the main dish and dessert. It was his survey of the year, essentially a collection of musings, and it was invariably interrupted by laughter, real laughter, not the polite or sympathetic kind. Bohdan delivered his poem in Polish, the language of the Wigilia, and my mother and I would struggle to grasp the essence, helped by my father or a cousin with the translation. But we never missed the twinkle in Bohdan's eye or the delight etched on faces around the table. These were unmistakable. It was on one such evening, in the din of cross-table conversation, that I picked up what seemed a remarkable phrase, the punchline to a story. "The obituary was written," Bohdan's wife Zosha was saying, waving a hand in the air. "Imagine, I was reading about the death of my husband in a newspaper, and look, he is sitting here now, all these years later." Fragments of the story followed. Bohdan had been a passenger on a ship sunk by a German submarine during the Second World War, and then a passenger in one of the ship's lifeboats. Logic and reports from the scene had made it clear. He was lost in the North Atlantic, starved or drowned, hundreds of miles from land. London press dispatches described a harrowing night and the following day's rescue of only a few dozen frostbitten souls. Bohdan Nagorski had not been among them. At the time, he was 49 years old. "She had no faith," Bohdan cried, smiling at his wife. More laughter echoed around the Wigilia table. "Bohdan, Bohdan," Zosha said, sounding exasperated. "Of course I had faith. You know I had faith." She shook her head, laughing softly. She had heard Bohdan's story many, many times. But for those of us who hadn't, it was easy to understand why Zosha, or anyone waiting for the ship's lost passengers, might have abandoned faith that September, all those years ago. The story came to me in patchy fashion, snippets tossed across the dinner table. It was fascinating to imagine my great-uncle drifting in a life.